So, Cal, I'm inviting you on here for a number of reasons. One of which is I got to be careful I don't lose my Burkean bona fides if I don't maintain the consistent ratio of mostly Burkean conservatives on here. I love all of my guests, but I had on recent fans of Peter Varick or gosh, if you go back far enough, before I had you on last, I had on your former compatriot Seth Root, bringing the Straussian version, and so we might vicariously try to give him a bit of a hard time throughout this conversation. But anyhow, it's great to have you back on. It's good to have someone who's in my, say, intellectual fold to bounce ideas off of in a conversation.
Absolutely. And, I haven't had a real in depth conversation about Burkean conservatism in a little while. So I don't know that I'm in the same danger of you as you are of falling into West Coast Straussianism here. But, let's have a conversation and kind of um, build up our bona fides, like you said.
And I had mentioned to you a while back I did want to have you on specifically for a Burke centric conversation, but man, that takes a lot of prep work, and I have not had time to do that, and so that won't be necessarily what we tackle today. But I wanted to ask you sort of or have a conversation around a sort of general pulse of where we're at on the right, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, in light of what I think is generally agreed to be sort of a resurgence or rise of nationalist populism. Um, both nationalism and populism, of course, terms we could spend an entire conversation debating what exactly do those things mean. But I want to start with the notion that kind of began this debate, or at least put flesh around the bones, if you will. I think kind of began with that article that came out years ago, Against the Dead Consensus, by which it was targeting its understanding of fusionism. Again, there's another term we could spend a long time defining, but I think broadly speaking, it was various voices on the right saying the elite cabal on the right has failed us. It's a dead consensus. We need to go a different direction. Do you think fusionism, or the consensus, if you will, is dead?
I think that it is like a generation that is like the oldest generation, sort of. It's the oldest generation of conservatism still alive, and I think it's dying off. I don't know where we look around in the conservative movement and see a lot of young fusionists coming up to a through positions of influence within the conservative movement. I think that though there are some smaller niche organizations that cater to that and promote that sort of viewpoint, but I don't see a widespread movement in favor of a fusionist viewpoint. And so those of us who still agree with that, everybody from you and I to candidates who candidates for president like Nikki Haley sort of maybe represented that banner a little bit when she was running. I think that view is on its way out. People are either converted. They've converted to the left if they hated Trump. They've converted to nationalist populism if they loved him, or they're dying off. It's just an older view of conservatism, and I don't think it will ever disappear, but I don't think it's going to be a prominent part of the the politically active conservative movement in the near future.
Does it seem to you? I'm trying to think how to ask this. Like sometimes I see from those who are anti-fusionists, say on the right, that there's a an almost desperation with which they want to chase out the last vestige of the fusionist establishment in the party, and by which I mean it's sort of this notion that if we could just get rid of this group over here, somehow we can all go on to live the life we want to. Instead, because the right has always been fraught with internal debate, but there is a certain degree to which it seems like there is a we cannot countenance this particular viewpoint. I'm thinking of, for instance, infamously Kerry Lake running for senator in Arizona, saying that essentially, look, if you guys voted for John McCain, get out of the room. The guy that had popularly won the very seat she was seeking in the state, for or well, had won the Senate of the state of Arizona, statewide race for decades. She was saying there is no place for anyone who would have supported a person like that. It didn't make as much news, but I was listening to an audio of J.D. Vance, and he was talking about those seemingly shrinking minority of Republicans within the United States Congress who are supportive of NATO as it's currently structured, who are supportive of continuing to send funding to Ukraine, literally said, "You do not belong in the Republican Party. There is no place for you." In effect, because you're so behind the times, you're so antiquated. Um, this seems like a very peculiar position for elected officials, both trying to get votes and trying to lead with a sort of a national mandate that they would create these. I mean, obviously, in politics, you have to sort of create your red line, say, here's who does or doesn't belong. Um, but could you speak to that? Like, why do you agree with that? Is there a certain amount of desperation or animosity that just seems unwarranted?
Definitely. And I think that there is a level of dishonesty as well. And it's not necessarily conscious. They might be dishonest with themselves, but there's two there's two levels on which we could think of a consensus being dead, right? There's an electoral level, or a legislative level, like have we been successful at persuading enough people to elect us and then enacting our agenda, right? And then on the other side, there's these ideas themselves are problematic and dead. They're proven to be empty. They don't provide any sort of value for the United States anymore, whether they ever did or not. And what's fascinating to me is that the the way that the problems of fusionism are presented by anti-fusionists is that it simply failed to enact anything conservative. It failed to conserve anything, right? Like that's what did conservatism conserve? That's the rhetorical
Right.
question, which is of course a nonsense question because you could write books on what conservatism conserved. You can do that even if you agree that there was a lot of failure to conserve as much as we would have liked to. But the idea that there is some sort of electoral failure or legislative failure or an agenda failure, and a failure to enact some sort of conservative agenda is the pretense for booting the fusionists from the movement. And yet it doesn't become, if that's your problem, the natural question is, okay, what's wrong with our messaging? What's wrong with the issues we're putting forward? What's wrong with the candidate? You can think of ways to change how you present your message, what issues you prioritize as things evolve. There's plenty of people who will say Reagan's ideals were great, but his policies are not really relevant 40 years after his presidency. Great. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is an entire philosophical shift under the pretense that conservatism hasn't conserved anything. There's a dishonesty about what the issue is. The real issue is that nationalists, populists, the anti-fusionist tradcon wing of and I don't mean like in the sort of a Kirkian sense, but like
Right.
you understand who I'm speaking of here. What's really going on is that they don't like the philosophical underpinnings and are making the excuse that it hasn't conserved anything, that that fusionism is flawed by its results when they think it's flawed inherently. And that's the argument that is ultimately made, but not the pretense on which the whole debate has started. And you can go back and look at Buckley. I know I'm kind of going I'm taking a little while to get to this point, but you can look at Buckley and say when he was putting together National Review, practically anybody who was conservative in any way was allowed to write for National Review or welcomed on the right to speak on whatever it was that they were remotely conservative on. Buckley had no illusions about where conservatism stood in intellectual circles in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s, and he had to put together some kind of movement. And he was not. You can never get this sense that he was somehow insecure about people who disagreed with him not being able to
Mm.
contribute. Right, like Ayn Rand obviously burned her bridges. The John Birch Society, they got booted out for obvious reasons,
Those are incidentally
but
the two names that are always mentioned, but
those
that's
are
about it.
that's yeah, exactly. And so you're bringing to the fusionism by definition brought together a lot of different ideas instead of drawing those hard lines. Anybody, I mean, like, can you imagine somebody like even Daniel Patrick Moynihan being a part of like a conservative movement today, somebody who was a
Hmm.
Democrat and a New Deal liberal, but he contributed a lot to at least the neoconservative movement. I think that the reason why not only is the philosophical pushback against fusionism a, a debate about its own merits and not its results, its own inherent philosophical merits, I suppose. But also the animosity is so strong, I think has to do with a psychological issue that I see all over the place in the trad movement and among a lot of extremely almost fundamentalist thinkers, where they're very insecure. They're very insecure about something they can't control, about something that they don't agree with, that is somehow a threat. Uh, I think that that is one of the things that differentiates the fusionist wing, what we might call the classical liberal wing of conservatism, from the more nationalist side. For national, like blood and soil nationalists, everything's a threat. Everything is us or them. There's a hard line of what is threatening versus what is safe and what is loyal, what is just on who's on your side and who isn't. That is just not seen on the other side. You wouldn't see that same reaction, which is ultimately perhaps the problem. Too many people who were antagonistic to fusionism were let into the fusionist conservative movement.
Yeah, and as you would clarify there in your response, that when you say tradcon, you're not lumping in the entire traditionalist mold, say the Kirkian, the very rich heritage there, um, which called to mind, I believe it was last year, in a lot of ways, the historical vanguard of a lot of Kirkian thought or ideas, ISI, invited as their keynote speaker Tucker Carlson. Um, Again, I think it was last year's big fundraising gala, um, which is just seems anathema to me of everything Kirk would have stood for. In all fairness, ISI, while it is very Kirkian, historically has been, doesn't claim to be a in the mold of Russell. It's not like the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, say, inviting Tucker Carlson in. This is they're allowed to invite who they do. It's just, to me, it was a noticeable turn from who they would court in the past. And part of the reason I bring that up is because Tucker said during his address, and admittedly, I don't know too. I know enough about Tucker's ideas to not want to know much more about his ideas, if that makes sense. But this surprised me. I didn't know this because Johnny Burke, the president of current president of ISI, made a statement to the effect of, "Now I know you're not a populist," and Tucker, laughed, kind of that traditional Tucker laugh, said, "No, I'm not a populist." Like, just adamantly denied he was a populist. And what he said he meant by that was he was against the elites as he understood it because they have failed us. Because they have not, going back to the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, the 2008 market collapse, if we want to sort of focus on, say, the Bush era, um, the elites have failed us, but I'm not a populist. I'm just saying they have. I want a different group of elites who don't fail us. Um, I have very little respect for Tucker, but I do want to use that sort of paradigm. Does that sound like populism to you, or maybe to put that another way, could a person echo Tucker's same words and have a valid point? The elites have failed us, therefore we need different elites.
Has there ever been a populism that didn't want new elites?
Well, they may not put it that way.
Yeah, maybe he's just being more honest than others. No, I mean, like I was just teaching Plato's regimes in a class this week, and talking about how the argument that Plato makes is once you get to democracy, a pure democracy, not sort of a republic type of democracy, the danger is that you're going to get a demagogue who is going to persuade everybody with his charisma and then take complete control, and now you have tyranny. And Alexander Hamilton made the same argument. This is an argument that has been a case that's been made for 2,500 years of political philosophy, that what ends up happening when people appeal to too much populist sentiment is that they're going to want to substitute is an elite that will work for the people better than the previous elites did. I don't think that's the issue. That's always what's put forward, and there's always somebody who's ruling. The idea of a pure democracy has never been considered feasible anywhere, and small communes are about as far as that sort of all the people own everything and decide everything and whatnot, right? So at some level, you're going to have elites. The question is not so much better or worse elites, but what sort of system incentivizes good elites, A, and also incentivizes bad elites to be less bad, I think.
Hmm.
And that's not the sort of thing that Tucker, I think, is arguing about here. And again, I echo, I know enough about him not to want to know more, so maybe he has spoken to that somewhere. But the, there's nothing for me in things like, should we support Ukraine against Russia, that somehow tells me this version of the elites is somehow less pro America, or not even pro America, but less effective in governing America than another. These issues are, they're never actually about performance, and they point to failures, but they don't offer substantive suggestions about how better elites would somehow have correctly handled the financial crisis of the late 2000s or responded to 9/11 or something like that.
Yeah, just for point of order, Tucker, as you may have noticed, this clip went around Twitter. I refuse to call it X, Twitter, a while back, about I don't know who the guy was. It was some guest on Tucker's program who made the comment that William F. Buckley was the greatest villain of the 20th century, to which Tucker wholeheartedly agreed. I couldn't agree with you more. So
Yeah, I mean, the only reason that somebody would make such an outlandish claim is because they're trying to push a certain group out of their movement. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, there are hundreds and thousands of people, even if you don't like Buckley, that you could seriously put in front of him in that list. It's only somebody who is trying to create a caricatured enemy and push them out would make a claim like that.
friend of the podcast and frequent guest. I need to have him on soon. Justin Stapley wrote something a year or two back. and I'll just read it here. He says, populist politics is typically just about being heard. That's why simply dismissing populist angst is always so fraught, because anyone who not only claims to hear the concerns but embodies them can rise to power out of nowhere, as we saw with Donald Trump. When a populist uprising becomes demagogic, the answer is to break up the monopoly of hearing and answering the populist concerns. Populist uprisings don't fade away by defeating them, but by reintroducing by reintroducing pluralism and offering more answers to the problems than just a single angry one. The question then for those like us who want to see the power of Trumpism fade is, what alternative vision can we offer to the concerns that have fed Trumpism with institution and that have fed Trumpism, and what institutions are at our disposal to offer that alternative vision? Now, obviously, I'll give you a chance to respond whether or not you even agree with the premise or the setup, but presuming you do, I think that's kind of the question we few fusionists have been wrestling with, right? It's if the answer here is not just dismissal and kind of scoffing, but rather hearing the concerns of the uprising of the populist masses and trying to offer them a better solution, or at the very least an alternative. Does fusionism offer that? Is it a matter of it just hasn't been packaged correctly? Have we not seen a national leader who's found a way, like say Reagan, to spread this message, or is there a necessary tweaking that needs to take place? With maybe you and I can define ourselves as fusionists, but still recognize some sort of tweaking has to take place as if it's going to have mass appeal.
So I think when I think about this, when I talk about fusionism, I am talking about this idea that it does not inherently contradictory to have a somewhat hawkish foreign policy, a basically free market, and traditional social values promoted in the public square. Just as a broad overview of that concept, um, I think that there's certain. What I would say to that is that I think that I wouldn't look to appeal to any one of those three pillars as the solution or the problem in this case. I think that where conservatives actually need, and not just conservatives, but um, anybody who's concerned about this in general needs to refocus is actually at the local level. And that could be within their own community, that could be within maybe different institutions like church, local government, school, all sorts of places. I think one of the best examples of this is a guest I believe that you had on your podcast, and actually where I believe that I was first introduced to this concept, but I believe you had Charles Marone from Strong Towns on your
Mm.
podcast and talking
Mm-hmm.
about the changes in development patterns um, in the well, originally in the post-war years, and now as we things are maybe starting to shift again as we get into the 21st century. But he offers what is a quintessentially Burkean alternative to how we develop our towns, and one that has seemingly worked for thousands of years. And we can I can use this as an example, as an opportunity to respond and balance out the fact that we're losing community in the traditional sense, right? So, um, for a long time, the people that you knew were the people who were nearby you. You couldn't travel or communicate easily with people around the world. And then we had mass culture through TV, radio, newspapers, things where there was a pretty broad consensus. Now that consensus is breaking up with the internet, but I think that that would be less of a problem. This idea that we're somehow cocooned in these like echo chambers, and we go online and we seek out these online communities. Maybe Christian nationalism is a big one I see on Twitter all the time. And algorithms are pushing us further and further into this extreme. This would be less of an issue if people had relationships and community with the people physically around them. And I think that if you take both of those pieces, the technology that pushes us into a digital and online sphere and allows us to pick our echo chamber community we want to listen to live in, and the breakdown of any alternative forms of community, we can see how this leads us to a new world that we don't quite know how we're going to deal with, but one that seems to reward extremism, dehumanization, and the lack of any sort of real relationships or community. And I think that a return to a more conservative and Burkean understanding of how to develop communities and spaces that we live in would help to balance that. We don't have to go out there and ban social media. Instead, we need to create an opportunity for this natural social side of humanity to become strengthened again. And so that's one that I would advocate for. That's an area that I would. And is that the anti-communist wing of fusionism? Is it the free market one? Is it the social issues one? I don't really know that it falls very much into any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe those things may be better as a national or state policy question, but at a local level, how are we advancing the communities and social relations that human beings need to thrive in? I don't know that that question is included or excluded naturally from fusionism.
So, um, you were you were the person who introduced me. You were the person who introduced me to Martin Gurry's The Revolt of the Public.
Yes, that is a book I do
Hold on.
judge by its cover, because the cover is like one of the coolest covers I've seen on a book
It's pretty
release recently.
awesome. A classical, perhaps romantic era woman holding a smartphone. Yes, very very cleverly put together. It's a 400 plus page book, so I'm going to do the author, a great disservice by just distilling this to a couple of sentences. But hopefully, so the audience can get the gist of it. This is from the book. My thesis is a simple one. We are caught between an old world which is decreasingly able to sustain us intellectually and spiritually, maybe even materially, and a new world that has not yet been born. Given the character of the forces of change, we may be stuck for decades in this ungainly posture. You who are young today may not live to see its resolution. If you'll pardon me just a second. Oh, there's a pretty good quote in here, too. And then skipping several pages ahead, and this is the deeper pattern of conflict. The programs of the center have failed and have been seen to fail beyond the possibility of invoking secrecy or propaganda. The result is paralysis by distrust. The border, it is already clear, can neutralize but cannot replace the center. Networks can protest and overthrow but never govern. Bureaucratic inertia confronts digital nihilism. The sum is zero. Speaking of nihilism, that's fairly dark, I guess. So we're just sort of stuck in this moment. But I've heard others express this as, the much maligned title, "The End of History," Francis Fukuyama. Um, that being said, people who dig into his argument from the left and right do sort of tend to agree, as I understand it, and I could be, again, overly simplifying him here, that sort of in this, the race between the Marxists, the fascists, the democracies won out. That in effect we have that we're not living in an era of constant revolt, or that the next sort of wave is here. That we're in this moment, and yet I think Gurry's kind of right that yes, we're stuck because nobody's really leading a wide. We don't have the genuine Marxist, almost religious-like faith out there, prophes. Promulgating some other message, some alternative. But we're also stuck and dissatisfied with this system. So I realize there's probably 20 questions buried in there, but I guess starting off, do you buy Gurry's framework? Are we stuck like this, or do you see it a little different?
I think that there's some inevitability to the framework that we're in. I think that his thesis has to do with this disintegration of a centralized system of information and opinion building and culture and that sort of thing. And it's so diffuse now. It is so polycentric, I guess, to you to invoke um, a I think there was a political scientist who coined that, Eleanor Ostrom, but she was referring to something completely different. But it seems polycentric. There's a million different ways that you get your ideas and that you get your culture and that you find your community and that sort of thing. And that seems like it's not ending anytime soon. I think that that is correct. I don't know that that in itself is inevitably the only power center. Again, I think if we can recenter and revitalize community, the physical community of the people present around us, that might undermine the sort of nihilistic trend of this sort of polycentric um, sort of culture building model that we seem to be stuck in. I don't know if all countries are going to respond the same to this. So Guri talks about, of course, the movements like Brexit and the populist ones, Occupy Wall Street in the U.S. I think he refers to the Tea Party. He talks about MAGA and it's right. Well, actually, I believe he actually sort of predicts it, and he wrote the book and published the book short before Donald Trump was even elected. But it's
Yeah, I think the
interesting.
version I have mentions Trump at the end as kind of
Yeah,
a
because I think a
second
later
version.
edition actually was like, oh yeah, and by the way, here's the. I mean, one of the best ways to judge a school of thought is, and he deliberately does this even with he tries to imagine a world in which his thesis is wrong, and then it turns out, of course, that after he publishes the book, the exact sort of thing that he would have predicted happens. That's a pretty good indication that he's onto something, I think. But
Sort of
he
like
talks about
Edmund Burke's Reflections of the Revolution in France was shockingly prescient.
yeah, 100%. Like he apparently, I mean, like you could read it and see him predicting the rise of somebody like Napoleon and all sorts of things. And what Guri, when he talks about he talks about both these sort of developed nations, Anglophonic ones like the U.S. and England, but then he also talks about countries with very different systems, talking a lot about the Middle East and Central Asia and places like Iran and what was the first? Egypt was one, but there was one that was particularly. I think it was Tunisia was the first one,
I
perhaps
think that
that
was the
was
first one.
the so-called Arab Spring. I think that it's interesting that the sentiment seems to be the same, but the reaction to it seems to be rather different in the sense that there's there's a potential for things like civil war, mass repression, or a coup in some of these um, in some of these other nations, and in the U.S. I mean, the January 6th was a horrifying day, and yet the the revolutionaries in France would have scoffed at how pathetic the people who tried to storm the Capitol were by comparison, right? It's one thing when you are oppressed to the point of barely having any sort of political and economic and social life. And it's another when you feel this dissatisfaction that you were talking about, that you were alluding to earlier, this sort of feeling. I don't know if that was the phrase that you used, but I sort of interpreted it as this is that there's a dissatisfaction with the system. We can push back against it. We can't really replace it. There's sort of a defeatism there. I think that's very different in the developed world, where largely we can look at a lot of numbers and see that the country's doing very well, and yet there seems to be a lot of underlying dissatisfaction, a lot of there's certainly some spiritual and psychological ill health that continues to be an issue. But how the country's going to react to that, I think, is very different from the way a lot of other nations have and will. And so, how that's going to play out and what's going to be the end result, I think it depends a bit on where you are in the world.
I did appreciate about Gurry's book exactly what you're mentioning, in that it has a very global focus. Because I think far too often, and maybe because we're Americans and the world centers around us in our minds, the entire discussion of the nationalist populism tends to try to lean heavily on explanations that make sense in the United States. But then when you look around the world, it's like, wait a minute, what does the demise of the cultural way of life, or the carving out of the Rust Belt states, have to do with the nationalist populist parties in Greece or Poland or elsewhere across the world? And I do take your point that the response to this could look radically different depending on what nations we're talking about. Heck, depending on how cohesive the system of government or the society is in the nations we're talking about. Um, but since I did not read all 400 plus pages of Gurry's book, does he ever reach some sort of a lasting, here's what we should be doing about this?
I don't remember. I mean, I remember him mentioning some small things, but they were much less of the focus of the book. And I think he even admitted this in the conclusion, that his options for solutions were much less a part of his argument than here's the problem and we need to figure it out. I think there was some allusion actually to what you mentioned, Justin Stapley's piece that you quoted earlier, talking about having a more pluralistic attitude. I think was definitely a central theme of his partial solution, or at least recommended response, if it's not a solution, for the time being. That um, the effort to sort of clamp down on it and reestablish the authority that the what he referred to as the center had over, and the elites and our sort of our common culture had over um, opinions and information, is the worst thing that we could do. And that instead, sort of embracing that and trying to do it in a healthy way was a better alternative. And I think that there's probably something to that, but I would suspect that, again, how a country's going to react to that opportunity is going to depend on a lot more than just that.
So I want to go back to something you had mentioned earlier. Your observation that a lot of the energy among the youth, say on the right, is not going towards fusionist institutions or ideas or politicians. Um, and this podcast deliberately caters to our generation, the millennials. I don't know at what point. I think we're getting closer and closer. I don't know what point you can officially say the millennials are no longer the young Americans. We're certainly not the kids these days. But since presumably we're getting a little bit older, I'm just curious to this idea that the kids these days have the wrong ideas in their head and are going the wrong direction is something humans have said since the beginning of time, or at least since the second generation. Is this overblown? Like, does this eventually correct itself? Like, what gives you pause to say either this is the new normal, that all of the energy is going into nationalist populism away from fusionism and will continue to do so, or is it sort of a, due to the election of, say, Donald Trump or some other factors, it's kind of the fad of the moment that will eventually revert backwards, because these are ultimately sort of hollow ideas that don't really get you very far.
Well, I mean, I think that in an imperfect world, all ideas fail, even good ones to some degree. And the nice thing about the youth is, and the youngest generation, is that they're always looking to institute something new that works better than whatever they grew up with. This is maybe a little bit of an anti-Burkean sentiment here that I'm expressing, but the I don't think that the issue is the kids these days, right? Like the yeah, I think it's unfortunate timing. I think that we could definitely point to earlier generations that were being introduced to the conservative movement around the time of, say, the Reagan Revolution, that we could praise for happening basically to jump on the train when the philosophical ideas of the movement were a lot better. I don't think it's that there's something wrong with this generation so much as this generation was failed by the people who passed on conservative ideas or so-called conservative ideas to them. And everybody is going to appeal. Anybody who appeals to the youngest generation is going to do the same thing that they do when they appeal to populism, which is to appeal to dissatisfaction.
Mhm.
But what are they going to offer as an alternative is the question. And right now, the institutions that are entrenched and energetic are offering an alternative to fusionism, and I don't think it's a good one.
Yeah. Pardon me. If you would indulge me, I would. I can we entertain a hard pivot?
Sure.
um, I often use as shorthand William F. Buckley, Thomas Sowell, Russell Kirk, and especially Edmund Burke is kind of my Mount Rushmore saving elephants conservatism. I could I could easily have a robust debate with myself why those four individuals either should or should not stay on that Mount Rushmore of saving elephants conservatism. And I've considered swapping one out over the years, but I still think it serves me relatively well. There is no one individual that I think fully embodies what I mean when I say conservative, but it seems like those four kind of help ping pong around the general notion of what I'm getting at. Of course, the blog post that continues to get the most traffic is 50 conservative thinkers, where I guess I've expanded that from 4 to 50.
That is a
If the
very
listener really
large
wants
Mount
to know.
Rushmore.
Yeah, that it
That
is.
would be pretty much all of South Dakota, I think, right?
Yeah, very large Mount Rushmore. But I'm curious because I'm not saying I'm necessarily wed to those four individuals. I just find them particularly helpful. Do you have a framework in which you think of here are some individuals that help kind of flesh out for me what I mean when I say conservatism, and if so, who would those people be?
I would definitely include at least three of those thinkers. Definitely Sowell and Buckley and Burke. Um, Kirk as well, although he wouldn't be the first person that would come to mind for me, and maybe it's just because I've spent less time with Kirk than the other three. And I also think other people who come to mind for me are people like Abraham Lincoln, Alexis de Tocqueville, Friedrich Hayek. Um, but it depends on the given day. Maybe I'd say Yuval Levin too, right? There's
Yeah.
there's just a lot of that's part of the issue with conservatism as an idea. It can't be any one thinker, or it wouldn't be conservative. It wouldn't be the prudential wisdom gained by experience, um, and applied and reformed and gradually adapted to our ever changing problems and our ever changing world, right? If it was any one person, You could say you can put objectivism and Ayn Rand on the same, like they're interchangeable. Marx and Marxism
Hmm.
are interchangeable, with maybe a little Lenin thrown in. And there's a lot of thought like that, but conservatism inherently has to be a broad and deep and long tradition because of its philosophical underpinnings. So there's a tension to being able to say, okay, here's my Mount Rushmore. If you want to like put me on a political compass of conservatism, if there were such a thing,
Right.
I'm grouped by these individuals. I think that there's merit to that because it's hard to explain. So many people mean so many things, not just in the US, but at different times, different places when they say conservatism, that it is hard to just say, I'm a conservative, I'm a fusionist, I'm this or that, and really get across the subtleties of your viewpoint. But on the other hand, it's a strength of conservatism that you can't just appeal to any one person, but that we are looking for um, and reconciling wisdom and understanding from a lot of different sources that seemingly don't. Maybe their project doesn't seem to be the same one to the other. Maybe that's why I think fusionism is actually sort of an inherently conservative um, project in itself. It's the idea that why we take the wisdom that we've accumulated in the face of various circumstances, and we try to put this together into something that approaches a coherent worldview that can help us explain and understand our daily experience. But it's it's just something about this idea that you can borrow from so many different things and really enrich conservatism that helps me to interpret. So I think it was Margaret Thatcher said that the facts of life are conservative. I think that what that's often interpreted to mean is I think what a lot of people use that to do is put these lenses on that say whatever, the Fox News conservatism of the day says, I need to filter everything through that lens and understand everything that I see, and if it doesn't fit, then it gets thrown out. It's fake news.
Hmm.
When instead, I think that what Thatcher was getting at is this idea that for the conservative, facts are not a threat to our worldview. They are ones that can be reconciled and included and understood properly in their context, and that only comes from being able to accept and appreciate wisdom from a lot of different sources. And so, a Big Tent conservatism has a tendency to be, I think, stronger as long as it has as long as it can close on something solid, like Chesterton once said, as long as there's some idea of what it is and isn't within that sphere, I think there is a lot of room for adding more understanding to how the world works from borrowing from a lot of different traditions.
And I do appreciate the way you approach. And by the way, hats off to Abraham Lincoln, who made it not only as a potential contender for your hypothetical Mount Rushmore, but is actually on the actual Mount Rushmore. So he's
how
two for
many how
two
many
there.
people could we include here? Let's see. So we have Jefferson. Jefferson's not super conservative, although he
No,
has some. I mean, there are some things we want to conserve of Jefferson. Washington, probably.
probably, yeah.
Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, 50-50.
Yeah,
I
it
don't know.
depends. Teddy Roosevelt may be, gosh, I think this might be a fair statement. He tends to evoke the strongest opinions among the right, as far as like he's either the enemy of conservatism or no, he was its true hero and the right man for the right time.
And
It's,
I'm going to
I don't know.
be like I usually am. I'm going to be that 1% that's like, I'm not on
50-50.
either one of those. Like, I can see both sides.
I imagine that makes you very popular in groups.
No.
No, I exact opposite. No, I was going to say I I really do think the way you're describing this is conservatism's central strength. It is what animates it, it's what gives it intellectual viability and vitality, right? It's what makes it not as rigid as Marxism, or dare I even say classical liberalism. It's not a fixed ideology that you can't wed it to any one individual or any group of individuals. It does obviously, though, also mean it has some unique challenges that those competing worldviews don't necessarily share. In that we spend a lot of time arguing with ourselves, what does this thing mean? And trying to ever fine tune where are the parameters around it. And I bring that up because I'm kind of curious. I'm sure you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. And I'm stretching his argument a little bit, but basically, this notion that humans come embedded with almost like moral taste buds, and that we can kind of react to those things, and that this could in part explain some of the differences between, say, the conservative or the liberal, in that one may be more interested in, say, equality or fairness, another in more security. If we borrow that kind of basic framework, is part of the potential problem for conservatism, as you and I seem to enjoy and seems to enrich us, is that there's an awful lot of people out there that would, well, let me put it this way, possibly the opposite of what we're talking about. I don't know if this is true. I don't know how much stock I put in it, but I've heard it explained before that authoritarianism is a latent trait in a certain percentage of the population, by which they mean there are historical events that trigger kind of an authoritarian impulse within people, and it's anathema to the complexities that conservatism naturally presents. Right? It's no. I don't want fuzzy lines. I need an ideology. I need something extremely clear to help me distinguish between the good guy, the bad guy, the right approach, the wrong approach, and that may not necessarily just be a person's moral fiber, but maybe just the way they're made up, right? They're uncomfortable with with the inconsistencies, or the seeming contradictions within a worldview, and so they gravitate towards one where there is no contradiction, because you simply vest all hope in either a central leader or some central idea. So again, I know that's a big setup to a question, but I guess, is that something? Can intellectual conservatism appeal to those who were never interested in intellectual pursuits of this nature, I guess?
I think probably not directly. I think not in the sense of inviting people who need something to be black and white into a conversation about nuance is probably going to be a losing proposition. I think where this becomes relevant for the conservative movement is to try to create shorthand answers to how the world works and what the problems are, where they come from, what the solution is, for people who are more black and white to grasp onto, and hopefully lead them in a way that's not authoritarian. There might be some sense in which a truly non-authoritarian conservatism doesn't appeal to those members of the population, and in which case I I gladly hand them over to the left, where they probably fit better anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a mistake for conservatism to change itself to become more black and white. I think that there is a sense in which, and this actually, I'm glad you brought it up this way, because we can go back to almost the first, I think, question that we had. Conservatism, I think, is inherently not black and white. But I do think that when we talk about the core of a fusionist versus an anti-fusionist, the so-called dead consensus argument, what we're what we're asking is the entire project of this nuanced conservatism, with all of its complexities and seeming contradictions and that sort of thing, is it not worthwhile? Do we throw the entire thing out? Or do we say, you know what? We need to repackage this in a way that is going to appeal to a lot of people who don't care about the intellectual nuances of it, but are looking for simple answers about how, like, this is, they have a lot of other things to think about in their lives than to ruminate on Burke and Kirk and Buckley. And what they really want to know is, what does conservatism as a political platform, so to speak, as a movement, what does it offer them? And that needs to be packaged in the right way, or else somebody's going to come along and appeal to the population with something much more black and white. And the only way to fight back, essentially, is to have our own version of that, something that doesn't caricature conservatism, but something that also gets to the point, which is probably the last thing that I should be doing. But judging by the length of our conversation, but I mean, I think that we need people who can, and I think this is the success. This points to the success of Ronald Reagan, be able to put this in a very down to earth and succinct and just everyday language sort of way. What are our ideas? What is this? How is this applied today? What answers does it give us? That's what's needed in the face of that type of personality, I think.
Yeah, so any political endeavor, you have to be able to capture it with slogans that never get you all the way there, right? They might evoke certain feelings or stuff. You know, one of the most successful slogans of the past 20 years, "Make America Great Again." We can reduce that to MAGA. We have an idea in our heads of what that means. It embodies an entire system of ideas. Even if you ask each individual who is all about it, they may have radically different notions of what those ideas actually mean and how they all fit together. But what's fascinating to me about that is that, as you mentioned, Ronald Reagan, he was the first one to use the "Make America Great Again." Or maybe I should rephrase. I don't know that he was the first, but he used it certainly before Trump did, for a very different purpose, right? He was embodying very different ideas. It's the same phrase, it's distilled down kind of in black and white. It's shorn of all that meandering that you and I get into with the intellectual debates, but standing behind it is either Trumpism or sort of a Reagan conservatism.
I think that was a question there too, but
I'm
or
sorry, Cal. Yeah, if you wanted to respond, I guess there wasn't a question.
um, yeah, I mean, what comes to mind when you say that is, um, Reagan would use these phrases like referring to the city on a hill and that sort of thing. And in his, was it his farewell speech, or it was towards the very end of his presidency, he took the time to say, this is the vision that I had.
It was literally his farewell speech. He even makes a statement to the effect of, like, "I've never been able to fully articulate it, but here's what I think this means,"
And he,
as he's leaving the White House.
yeah, precisely. And so he boils down, he's used these ideas, and they have been a part of his philosophy for 20, 25, 30 years, that he's been speaking to on campaign circuits and as governor of California, and as communicating from the bully pulpit. But he boils it down succinctly to this idea of, the shining city on a hill is inviting, the oppressed from all over the world. It sounds almost like, and I believe he delivered the speech with the Statue of Liberty in the background, but it sounds like something written on the Statue of Liberty. And if there must be, he says something to the effect of, if there must be a wall, or there should be a huge wide gate for anybody, essentially anybody, to come through. And I contrast that with this mental image of this cartoon I saw on social media recently, where Um, the Statue of Liberty has this whole like gigantic wall constructed around it, and the idea was the only way that we can preserve this sort of like liberty of the Statue of Liberty is if we build the wall, like Trump has been saying. It's a completely opposite mindset about what America is about and where it stands in the world. There's a welcoming one, and there's a stay out sort of
Hmm.
viewpoint, and they use the same terms and they talk about the same issues, and they mean entirely different things by it. The content of it is very, very different, and so it is possible to appeal in a populist way, I think, to the black and white viewpoint of many people who don't have time for the nuance. But the content of the ideas needs to be conservative, not nationalist, not populist.
Well said. Cal, I could talk to you for a while, but I think this would probably be a good time to wrap it up. I'm going to definitely have you back on more often because, like I said, I need my Burkean friends in this dark and discouraging time.
Well, we should dive into Burke himself a little bit more, I think, in a future episode. I have to pull out my books on Burke that are stashed in various places since I moved, but um, maybe we can kind of delve into that a little bit more deeply in a
We
future
need to.
podcast.
I got lost. I was supposed to be reading Burke, but I got lost in his great counterparty, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. Never read it before. I was actually surprised Burke's name was mentioned on just about every other page. It was very directly aimed at Burke's reflections on the Revolution.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I remember when I first read it when I was younger, and I thought, this Paine guy makes so much sense. And I read it again after reading Burke, and I'm like, where does he get these ideas anyway? It's funny how that works, and I think that Paine is somebody who is he is. I mean, he wrote the book Common Sense, right? And it seems
Hmm.
like a very common sense notion, and he may be aware, but he makes no allusions to the idea that it seems like common sense because he's appealing to all of the ideas that you are sort of marinated in from birth in the American colonies. And the great thing about Burke is that he helps you to sort of step out of those immediate ideas and take a broader view of history and of the purpose of government. So um, every time
Well,
I
and I
read him, I
think
feel like I get something new.
yeah, and I think as we were talking earlier about Burke being so prescient in a lot of what he said, and look, Paine is a brilliant writer. He's worth reading. I'm not saying he didn't have some pretty good ideas, uh, but what strikes me the most in The Rights of Man by Paine or Reflections on the Revolution in France by Burke is not so much their ideas or what they said, but how right or wrong they were with where they thought this was going. And whereas with Burke predicting in a lot of ways the terror, the rise of Napoleon, the beheading of the monarch, Paine was the exact opposite. I mean, to him, the revolutions in America, and especially France, was the beginning of this flowering, unstoppable democratic movement to sweep the globe and bring us to the sunny uplands of history. And it's amazing in hindsight how wrong he was.
Yeah, and Jefferson as well, for the same
Yeah.
reason, unlike people like John Adams, who we could also put on that pantheon of conservative uh, thinkers that go on onto our Mount Rushmore, I
Or
suppose.
Mount Rushmore, yeah. Yeah, well, he's in my list of 50. He's one of my favorite founders.
And
In a lot
maybe
of ways, it's,
this is a debate we need to have at some point. Who were the best writers out of the founding fathers? I put
ooh,
forward Adams actually as the best, um, which might
gosh,
not
that's
be the popular choice, but I think I could make a case.
Gosh, yeah, that's a good question. As much as I don't get me wrong, prefer Adams over Jefferson. I mean Jefferson's just so eloquent, but Maybe we need to fine tune what we mean by best.
Well, that's all subjective, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
All
here's
right.
what
Well,
we'll do. We'll read Burke's what is it, discourses or whatever on the sublime and the beautiful, and
oh yeah,
understand aesthetically what we should be looking for, and then we'll have a Burkean framework for who the best writer of
there
the
you go.
American revolutionaries and founding fathers were.
And just in case we haven't chased away the last vestige of the listener that wasn't interested in that sort of stuff. All right. Well, hey, this is much like our conversation on the Are We Right podcast, where it just sort of meanders at the end and has no natural ending. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for coming on the show. Hope to have you back soon, Cal.
Thank you for having me.